name. And everyone said amen. Before you're seated, turn to your neighbor and tell him two choices. Two choices. God bless you. You can be seated. Sustained in Egypt during a time of famine, we see that Abram gained much. On the heels of deception, after convincing the Egyptians that his wife, Sarah, was his sister, for fear that if they knew that Sarah was indeed his wife, that they would kill him so that they could take his wife. So he deceived the Egyptians. He hatched this plan to convince them that Sarah was not his wife, but instead his sister. And so on the heels of that deception, of that plan, we see that Abram increased in wealth as he was treated well while in Egypt because of the beauty of his wife. And a blessed husband this morning say amen. Genesis chapter 12 and 16 shows us that Abram had sheep, oxen, colts, men servants, maid servants, with Sarah herself even being gifted with her own colts and camels. However, it would not be long until Pharaoh began to feel the consequences of Abram's dishonesty, as plagues came to his house because of his own pursuit of Sarah. His intentions, quite frankly, pure, because he just simply thought that she was Abram's sister. But indeed, Sarah was Abram's wife, and that was one thing that God would not allow Pharaoh to touch. And so once it was made aware that he had been deceived, Pharaoh demanded that Abram leave. Fortunate to not be killed immediately on the spot by a raging Pharaoh who found out the truth, Abram gathered up together his wife and all that he had as he was sent out of Egypt. So we would turn the page to Genesis chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, reading two verses, where we read that, so Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the south. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. Albeit under false pretenses, Egypt had been good to Abram for a time. They had escaped famine, treated well by Pharaoh. They left with more than what they entered in with. But not only Abram alone, but also Lot, who was with him. Because in Genesis chapter 13 and verse 5, we read that, and Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and his own tents. Both Abram and Lot knew all too well what Egypt had to offer. They had experienced the great crops. They had experienced the myriad of fruits and vegetables. They experienced the great wealth that resided within that nation of Egypt. They knew all too well what Egypt had to offer, and they themselves had benefited from those things. But now, expelled from that place, they were left once again with less than what they needed. Because we read in Genesis 13 and 6, as we continue through our story, that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. It wasn't really that Abram and Lot had an issue with each other, but rather the herdsmen of the two ended up not being able to get along. Where they had set up camp, where they resided, the place where they were at, it just quite frankly was too small. It wasn't enough. There was too much confusion. There was too much there to try to keep track of. As a great number of sheep and oxen that grazed throughout the day, it became too difficult to keep track of what was whose. And as dusk would fall and as the herds were separated, the count in each camp would inevitably be incorrect. And so it was this quarrel of the keepers, which Livestock would graze over the greener grasses, would become too much of an irritant, that we see that Abram approached Lot in Genesis chapter 13, verses 8 and 9. And we hear the words of Abram. He says, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen." Abram was saying, listen, there's no need to fight. There's no need for our herdsmen to quarrel. There's no need for any of that. We're family. We're family, he said. Verse 9, "Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." You would hope, confronted with the possibility of separation, that Lot, quite frankly, would beg to find a solution that kept them together. Lot, the nephew, with his uncle, Abram, you would have thought that just the mere idea of being separated from Abram would be enough for Lot to say, no, we can't do that, Abram. We've got to figure this out somehow. We've got to work together. We've got to put this quarreling to rest. Because to this point, the only mention of Lot was that Lot was with Abram. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse 4, we read that Lot went with Abram. In Genesis 12 and 5, we see that Abram took Lot. In 13 and verse 1, again, we see that Lot was with Abram. And in Genesis chapter 13 and verse 5, after listing the great riches of Abram, we read that, "And Lot also." Everything that we know about Lot up to this point was so directly tied to Abram. Lot had been doing life with Abram every step of the journey, escaping famine, discussing dreams, increasing wealth. It all happened as Lot was with Abram. While in passing, this is a point that is worth making. Because as we look at the impetus of why this separation began, it all began because the herdsmen in the field were fighting. And so the point this morning that I feel is not the main point, but a point that we must consider. That we cannot allow what is happening in the field to dictate what happens in the home. That what goes on, what's going on out in the distance, things that quite frankly don't matter. We have to understand that it is not worth allowing our home and what happens to the most important relationships that we have be dictated by what's going on in the field. Abram said it. He said, "We are family." And too easily we allow what goes on in our workplace, what's happening with our bank accounts and our investments, what's going on in our surroundings, what we see scrolling our social media feed. We allow those things that are going on out in the field to create fractures in relationships that are God ordained. And instead of taking care of the fighting in the field, it causes this resolute decision to be made. It's time to separate. I'm here to let you know that the relationship with your spouse, the relationship with your children, the relationship with your siblings, and dare I say the relationship with our brothers and sisters sitting in the pews across from us, they should never be made subject to grumblings in the field. It doesn't matter how bad it may look on the social media feed. It doesn't matter what surrounding circumstance may have caused us to get here to even consider what's going on. But we cannot allow the grumblings and the fighting in the field to make its way into the home, to begin to divide and to fracture and to tear apart the most important God-ordained relationships that we have. There's plenty of scripture for it, but we won't take the time. It's in there, trust me. If you don't, read it for yourself. But we have to find a way to work it out. It doesn't matter how bad it may seem. It's just an issue out in the field. It doesn't matter what has caused the fracture, the division, or the difference of opinion. It's just quarreling by the keepers out in the field. Those things ought to be secondary to the God-ordained things that God has for us. The field is secondary to the home. Changes should be made in the field before life-altering decisions take place back at home. But unfortunately for Lot, this isn't the case. He's more concerned about the field than the home. He's more concerned with his possessions and what he has control of than he is with his relationships. And it's at this point where we begin to see the effects of two choices. Genesis chapter 13, continuing in verse 10, we see that after this proposition made by Abram, in verse 10, it says that, and Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, and the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 11, so Lot chose for himself, of course, the Jordan Valley. Abram gave him full right. You choose where you want to go. You go that way, and I'll go that way. No matter which direction, I'll go the opposite way. And so Lot thought within himself, great, I'll just go and chase what looks the best. And so Lot journeyed east. Thus, they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. From this point, because of this choice, the direction that Lot chose to go from this place, Lot's life was marked with war and misery. Looking to the place that seemed to offer it all, a solution for every problem, he set up camp, and it ended up being in the direction of wickedness. We see that from here. Lot and his family would end up being taken as captives after the cities would fall. We would then see that his family would end up taking up residence in the wicked city of Sodom. We would see that eventually Lot would offer his daughters for pleasure of lustful men within the city to try to save himself and those that were in his home. His wife too fell in love with Sodom and Gomorrah so much that as they fled the city while it was being destroyed, she looked back and instantly became a pillar of salt. After the warning of God had already gone forth, she couldn't help herself but just look back, and it was over. He stopped short and he would live in the mountains. He was taken into an incestual relationship with his daughters and conceived sons who would become the fathers of the Moabites and the Ammonites, both of whom became forever enemies to the descendants of none other than Abram. One choice, one decision, in the heat of the moment, he looked, evaluated, and decided, I'm going to go towards what I think has every answer to all the problems in my life. I'm going to set up camp in this place. Again, in verse 10, I want to pull out one phrase for us this morning. Verse 10, and Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere. And this is what I want you to see. Like the land of Egypt. Like the land of Egypt. Yeah, of course, it says like the garden of the Lord as well. But Lot never had a chance to experience that. He never walked into the garden of the Lord. The only exposure that Lot ever had was to the land of Egypt. I don't think that it was so much what Lot chose. After all, is there anything wrong or evil about a well-watered plain? The views boasted of promise, prosperity. There was plenty of room, plenty of grass, plenty of water, flatlands with rich soil. It seemed like a perfect place, and I'm sure that, in fact, it was. Yes, its proximity to Sodom and Gomorrah certainly is questionable. But before Lot took his first step towards that wicked city, before he even set up camp close as far as Sodom, it wasn't what, but it was what it represented, like the land of Egypt. I think that we make a grave error when we forget how we got our blessings in the first place, and we only remember where and in what season we got them. We separate ourselves from what is godly in pursuit of what reminds us of Egypt. We forego the things that is ordained by God, because in the moment where there's problems, where there's arguments, where there's disputes, where there's less than, where it feels like the future is on the line, our fleshly default is to find a solution in the moment that we think is going to take care of it all. And we think back to the times where we were financially stable. We think back to the times where our relationships were good, where the home life was good, where the marriage was strong, where the relationship with the kids were all good. We remember back to those times, and all we think about is what was going on in Egypt, what we had access to, the other money, the other relationships, the other things that we have. And I think sometimes we forget about how we got our blessing, and instead we only think about where we got it, where we were in a season of life when the blessings of God began to go in. In dealing with these issues and problems, Lot's love for the temporal, Lot's love for the now, Lot's pursuit for success in this life. The world was revealed, and he chased after things that looked like the land of Egypt. Might I just dare say and warn us this morning that when we are facing quite possibly the biggest decision of our lives, don't go looking for things that look like Egypt. Don't be looking for solutions that this world has to offer. Don't go and figure out how you can make more money. Don't try to figure out how you can go and stir up more opportunity. Don't try to figure out what else you have to do to benefit from the things that this world has to offer. Don't look up and only see the world. I would admonish all of us this morning, do not look for things that look like Egypt. We need to make sure that our decision is not based on what this world has to offer. Our choice and our decision is based on what God ordains for us to have. And it's so devastating to see the life of Lot unravel after an enormous amount of promise that existed in his life, because he tied himself to Abram, and he went with Abram, and Abram took him, and Abram led him, and Abram let him benefit from the things that were going on in Abram's life. Lot was deceived, and he thought, you know what? I can do it on my own. Here's a place that looks like abundance. I'm going to chase after that. And his life fell apart, and it's a tragedy. And while that one choice was a terrible one indeed, one that we ought not pursue, in this story of two men and two outcomes, it must be highlighted that there were two choices made. It was, in fact, Genesis 13 and 11, where Lot made his choice. But I would make an argument that for Abram, his choice was made all the way back in Egypt, when he had to decide where he was going to go next. with his life somewhat in turmoil once again, being ousted from Egypt because of the decisions that he made. Quite frankly, he put himself in this position because he lied and deceived Pharaoh. And he was on the move once again towards desert plains because of his own decisions and his own deceptions and what he chose to do. But now finding himself in the position to make a choice of where he was going to go next. Yes, there was wealth, but Abram could feel all that he had beginning to slip. And as he was displaced, as he was being uprooted, as he was picking up his life in search of where to place his tent next, with the hot desert sun beating down on his head and all of his company behind him, no doubt complaining, "I can't believe we're doing this again, Abram." Abram had already made a decision. He had already made a choice. Abram already knew there was really only one choice to make and one place to go. Two verses that I skipped over that quite frankly might be the most two important verses of this entire story. Rewinding all the way back to Genesis 13 at the beginning, verse 3 and 4, we read that as he left Egypt, he journeyed on from the south as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. When uncertainty loomed over his head, Abram knew that he had to get back to where it all started. When he could feel the wealth and the things of this world beginning to slip through his fingers, he already knew and he saw the love that Lot had in his eyes for Egypt. He knew that relationship was already on its way out. He knew he was wise, he could see it. Abram knew that in this place where it seemed like everything was getting ready to fall apart, nothing was as it used to be or as it should have been. We read that this place between Bethel and Ai certainly was not the first time that Abram placed his tent. He'd been there before. It was important to him. It was something he could not get out of his mind. And it mattered not how far the distance was that he had already traveled. He always was familiar with that place between Bethel and Ai. Before they even entered into Egypt, in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 8, we read this. From there, Abram moved to the hill on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there, for the first time in that place, he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. He'd been there before, between this place of the house of God and a place of ruin. How different of two places there could have been, of ruin and of the house of God. But here Abram finds himself and he builds an altar and he calls on the name of the Lord. Sure, it was a place of Abram's second altar, because Abram's first altar, in just a few verses earlier in Genesis 12, that altar marked promise. But this altar between Bethel and Ai, this altar marked relationship. This altar marked the place where Abram knew, I can call out with my voice to God. I can cry out to the Lord. I can have a relationship with him. I can begin to grow what I have with God in this place. The first altar, sure, it marked promise, but this altar of more importance, it marked relationship in pursuit of the promise that God had already already spoken. And it was there where Abram began to learn how to build his relationship with the God of promise. He had been given a promise of blessing and of favor, seeing not what the moment possessed. But in chapter 12 of Genesis, God began to speak to Abram things that were to come, giving him visions for the future. And it was at this altar between Bethel and Ai that Abram began to truly learn the importance of choosing a relationship with God. It was really this choice of choosing his relationship with God over choosing things that looked like Egypt, that could have been the most holy thing that Abram could have done. He chose the path of holiness, separating himself from anything that resembled the world, that resembled Egypt. He separated himself from that, and he said, I'm going to choose the path that maybe no one else wants to go down. I'm going to choose the path that worked out well for me before. I'm going to choose a path where I learn to have a relationship with God. I'm going to choose a path that separates me from all unholy and wicked living. I'm going to choose the path of holiness. And it was the choice of Abram to live a life that was holy, that now, once again, finding himself in this place, it was at this altar once again between Bethel and Ai, where Abram first began to truly learn the importance of choosing a relationship with God. Not to be drawn to greener pastures or promising fields, and instead just simply choosing, I'm going to go back to how it was at the very beginning. This was the best choice that Abram could have ever made. I'm going to go back to what I know works. I'm going to go back to the thing that I know brought this great blessing. I'm going to get back to the very things that I know. Yeah, maybe everything wasn't the most perfect. Yeah, everything maybe wasn't giving me the greatest wealth. Yeah, I might have spent a season in Egypt, and I gained great wealth while I was there, but Abram knew, I've got to get back to where it all started. I've got to get back to the original point of establishing a relationship with God in pursuit of things that he has spoken to me in times of prayer, promise that have been passed on because I heard God's voice and I decided to pursue that instead of what this world has to offer. Abram made the decision, I'm going to get back to depending on God. I'm going to separate myself from the resemblance of Egypt. And it didn't matter what Lot chose, because to the left and to the right, it mattered not to Abram, because he knew that God would be with him, whichever way that he went. What Abram was left with once Lot made his choice, it appeared scant. Foliage was sparse. The rocky ground didn't look like it could ever yield a harvest. He was left looking across a landscape of something that did not look like it was full of promise, like the valley that Lot had chosen. But here Abram is looking across, and it doesn't look like much. It doesn't look like he's going to be able to survive. It looks like he's going to continue to lose a lot. He's going to lose his crops. He's going to lose his livestock. His family might even turn their back on him. The maidservants and the men servants, they may choose to go another way when they realize how bad this place really looks, because there was no immediate benefit. But we see the mindset that we're admonished by Paul to have in Philippians chapter 4 and 11, that I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. It doesn't matter what would lay before me. It doesn't matter what other option may be out there. It doesn't matter what other things I could have chased. I'm going to be content with whatever lays before me, because I know that no matter what it is that lays before me, if I choose the path of holiness, if I choose to separate myself from the things of this world and choose to pursue my relationship with God, I know I can be content because God will go with me. And I'm standing before all of us here, whether it's today, whether it's another, whether it's already come or it's coming soon. We're all faced with two choices. Am I going to choose what looks like Egypt, or am I going to choose just simply what's holy? Separated living, chasing after my relationship with God. Nothing else matters other than my relationship with God. As you stand this morning, it would also do us well, while we're so familiar with the destruction of Lot's life after his choice. We see that once they were separated, and in that place between Bethel and Ai, as Abram's trying to figure out where to place his feet, when there's ruins on one side, but the house of God is on the other. Because his decision and his choice, before he ever even left Egypt, he chose, I'm going to go back to that original spot. We would see that once Abram got back to that place where his relationship with God began, promise once again began to be spoken. Because it was as Lot was walking off into the distance of what seemed like great promise and abundance, God would begin to once again speak to Abram. Verse 14, we read that the Lord said to Abram, after that Lot was separated, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, north and to the south and to the east and to the west. For all the land which thou seest, to thee I will give it, and to thy seed forever. And I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth, so that if any man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain, which is Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. As we stand here this morning, and maybe you're caught up in a moment of disappointment. Things have spiraled out of control and you don't really know how you got here. Circumstance has happened and you don't even know how to interpret it. You see others like Lot walking off into the distance towards promise and abundance, great things that this world has to offer. And you're standing in this place wondering if it's all worth it. And I'm just here to remind all of us this morning, if we'll just make the choice to go back to what matters the most, that is our relationship with God, where it all began, that original place where we learned from the very beginning to depend and to trust on our relationship with God. If I can get back to that place and I can stand there and not call after Lot as he's walking away, not call after and say, oh man, that valley looks great, can I go there with you? I didn't mean what I said. Instead of chasing after the things of the world, we keep our feet planted in a place where it doesn't seem like there's much to offer, where there's not much of a future. And if we'll just choose to live holy, if we'll just choose to separate ourselves, if we'll just choose to not Give way to quarreling in the field, but focus on the home. Focus on what matters the most. If we choose to separate from the world and focus on our relationship with God, promise once again will be spoken into your life. Not new promise, old promise. Promise that you've heard before. Promise that you were familiar with before. Promise that you're so well knowing about. But it means you've got to make a choice this morning. You've got to get back to the altar that you built so long ago and say, God, I want to cry out once again. It's not perfect. Things are a mess. There's disputes. It looks hopeless. But I want to encourage you today. Make a choice today that will define the rest of your life. Choose to be holy than choosing to go after things that look like Egypt. Choose to be holy, and God will repair, God will restore, God will renew, God will heal, God will set free, God will break bonds of addiction. God will break whatever you need today. If you'll just make the choice, I'm going to set up camp where I know I can get a hold of God. It may have been a long time since you've been able to get a hold of God, but I'm here imploring you today, won't you make a choice? Won't you make a decision to take that first step out and to get back to the place where you know things can be repaired? Won't you have enough boldness, faith, and confidence to go back to an altar that you've already built, but you want to go back because you know that's where I heard the voice of God, and that's where I know I'll hear the voice of God once again. There's two choices. Which choice will you make today? Which choice will you make today? Eleanor Roosevelt once said, one's philosophy is not best expressed in words. It is expressed in the choices one makes. In the long run, she said, we shape our lives. And we shape ourselves. The process never ends until we die. And the choices we make are ultimately our own responsibility. You may feel, and it may be true, that you're standing looking at barrenness because of a choice that someone else made. But none of it matters if you just come back to an altar where you're sure you're going to hear the voice of God and your future will be shaped forever. I want everyone to close your eyes. I want you to lift your hands. I want you to begin to ask God to speak to you right now. We're getting ready to move into the last part of this service, which is the most important part, and that is the response to the word that God brought to us today. I don't want anyone to slip out thinking that this word was not for them, but I want you to hear a preacher's voice today. It matters the choice that you make next. It matters the choice that you go and make from this point forward. Not to go after the things that look like Egypt, but rather to set up camp where you know you can call out and ask God, speak to me once again. If you're here and there's brokenness, I would ask, have enough courage to step out right now and come and find a place at an altar already built, a place where you've already felt the presence of God, maybe years back, and now you don't know how you ended up here. But is there a man? Is there a woman? Is there a husband? Is there a wife? Is there a child? Is there someone here that is broken and downtrodden? Is there somebody here that doesn't know what the right decision to make next is? I'm just imploring someone, if you need God to speak into your life again, this altar is open. Won't you step out of your pew, come down and seek to hear the voice of God once again. Oh, come on, stepping out is no act of condemnation, Stepping out is no admission of guilt. Stepping out only shows and reflects a desire from within to get back to the very beginning, to get back to what started it all to begin with. Stepping out shows that you care about what your future looks like. Stepping out shows that you want to repair those things that are broken. Stepping out shows that you put your faith and your trust in God. There may be someone in this room that feels like they've been betrayed by someone who should have been the most important person in their lives. God can repair it. God can renew it. God can restore it. God can heal it. Someone may be battling a sickness. I want you to come to a place where you know that healing has been poured out before, and we're just calling it out. It'll be poured out once again. Oh, come on, we're going to sing in just a moment. But is there someone who just wants to make the choice? I want to choose to be holy. I want to choose, God, to get back to where it all started. I want to choose to go to an altar where I know I can hear your voice. Your promise is spoken, God. Where I know the future is going to turn out all right. Where I know, God, it may look scant. Oh, there may be sparseness all around. But God, I'm depending on you. God, I'm depending on you. God, I need you this morning. Yeah, that's it. God, I pray right now in the name of Jesus. We feel broken this morning. We feel hopeless, God. There are others that are enjoying the spoils of the world, but here I am, ever faithful, and it looks like I don't have much. But I know that it's in this place that my future is shaped. I know that it's this choice to live holy and separated that repairs those things that have long been broken. I know today, God, that you're going to restore someone's mind. You're going to restore someone's marriage. You're going to restore someone's hope. You're going to restore someone's life. You're going to restore someone's mind.